Now, what we're going to do now is to move on to consider what our transport sector would look like if Ireland was a leader in the area. And for this session, we're joined by Dr. Brian Caulfield, who's Associate Professor in Civil, Structural and Environmental Engineering in Trinity College Dublin. And Dr. Caulfield is also the Chair of the Irish Transportation Research Network. Another interesting presentation coming down the tracks.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning everybody. It's a real honour to be here to speak to you today. I was at a conference in Japan recently and I was telling them that I was coming to speak to you about transport policy, and all of my international colleagues were taken aback that we had such engagement from the citizens, and it was something that the Irish government were doing, so it's a real honour to talk to you. Also, I've got 20 minutes, so I've got to talk about what I think about transport, distill my career into a number of slides, and to try and hammer home the message that I see in terms of sustainable transport. So you all know who I am. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about the problem setting. A lot of this was done by Anne and the great work that they do in the NTA to manage our transport system. But I'm going to show you some slides around congestion and where we are in terms of a transport system. Then I'll talk about what the future transport network could look like. I will talk about examples of how we can reduce our emissions, the barriers to change, and this is one of the biggest things, the barriers that we have to try and overcome in the transport sector. I feel they're bigger than some of the other sectors. Some international examples from other research projects that I've done and other best practice across the globe and things that we can achieve here in Ireland. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the role of the state, what the state can do to reduce our emissions, and then finally conclude. So in Ireland, we have about 2 million cars, and this is likely to increase, or it's projected to increase to 3 million by 2050. You'll have to excuse me as well, I'm getting over a cold. The demand for transport, as our economy recovers, the demand for transport is increasing. Congestion levels are rising in our towns and our cities, and as you saw from the data that the NTA have just proposed, the scale of the problem is large. So I'm going to show you three of the cities. I hope you can see the slide. This is taken from the TomTom Congestion Index, and TomTom measure congestion globally. So it's a good indicator of where Ireland sits. We're not the worst. It only looks at the cities, but we're not the worst. Here you can see congestion levels in Dublin are at 43%, and it's an increase of 3%. So this is data from 2016. It says basically that we travel an extra 50 minutes a day in Dublin because of the congestion. It's only road traffic. It's not public transport that we're looking at here. So this is Dublin. They only measure 3 cities. Cork is the next city. Congestion is increasing here as well. The congestion figures aren't as bad for Cork. It's increased by 1% on the previous year, 40 minutes of extra travel time per day. And then finally Limerick. Limerick again isn't as bad, 27%. Some of the worst cities in the world are up around 55% in terms of their congestion levels. So that's the congestion that we have. And the car causes this. And one of the interesting facts about the car, anytime I show this fact, people will either agree with it or disagree with it, but our cars spend 95% of their time parked. So you can see it's a very wasteful resource. So it's the equivalent of buying a house and living in it for 18 days a year. So it's a very wasteful resource that we use. Then also in terms of public transport, where we stand, Anne showed us some data on where the country stands, but these are the European capitals. And they go from Ljubljana, at the far right there, you've got Copenhagen, and then Amsterdam, and then you've got Dublin. So Dublin is about 21% compared to the other countries. But to look at Copenhagen and Amsterdam in this context, any of you that know anything, or any of you that have read anything about Copenhagen and Amsterdam, you will know that they've got very high cycling usage. And Dublin has a relatively high cycling usage as well. But their sustainable modes will be up around 65–70%. So it shows where Dublin is, and I only took the EU capitals here for this slide. One of the things I feel about transport is that we have a space problem. We don't have a transport problem. If we wanted to have a city that had cities that had large motorways that transected the cities, and we would be able to get everybody to drive in and out, That's a city that's got a lot of cars. It's not the kind of city I want to live in. It's got a city that's got a lot of pollution. So this slide basically shows you the space that's required for everybody to drive on their own compared to a tram. And again, this slide here, what I want you to focus on is the yellow bars there. So at the top, you've got pedestrians, cyclists, car users, a full bus or a full tram. The yellow slides there indicate the space that's required for these modes of transport. So you can see that somebody driving on their own, the space that they require is much larger than any of the other modes of transport. And as you saw, as Anne said, a large majority of our trips that are made in Ireland are done this way. So you can see that it is a space problem. And giving up space away from cars to public transport is the kind of debates that we need to be having in our urban areas. Then I've been asked to talk about aviation. It's not something that I'm an expert in, but it's something that we cannot ignore. A return flight to London, so this was taken from one of the carbon calculators, which I believe you've all had the chance to use. It shows that there's 280 kilograms of CO2 to travel on a return trip to London. So this is similar to driving a car for 1,400 kilometers. So this shows the extent of the problem in terms of aviation. And again, it's something that we can't ignore, but as an island nation, it's something that's obviously very important too. So how do we reduce our emissions? There is no quick, easy answer. If I had the answer, I'd be a very wealthy man. But there are two general approaches, and these are approaches that Anne has spoken about, and these are approaches that are globally done. The first one being that we change how we fuel our vehicles. We electrify, we put in biofuels, compressed natural gas, etc. We spend money on that. The other way, and this is the harder way, is that we reduce our reliance on the private car. We get people out of the private car into public transport, walking and cycling, and shared car use, which is something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So what would a future transport network look like? It would look like that in urban areas that the majority of people would travel by public transport. Walking and cycling would take up the majority of short trips, and short trips are where a lot of emissions come from. If you're driving from your home to the shop and it takes 2 or 3 minutes, you've got what we call a cold start. So the car starts cold and the emissions profile is much higher. So this is where possible, walking and cycling takes up these short trips. And then you've got cities and urban areas of short distances. And then finally, that the trips that are made by car are made by using private vehicles, are used by electric cars or the lowest emission vehicles possible. So there are a number of wider economic benefits from doing all of this investment. Health benefits. There's huge health benefits. We've done work in Trinity where we've looked at World Health Organization models to show the benefits of investing in cycling. You've decreased the number of sick days, our lives are longer, etc. So there's a lot of health benefits. Also, by decarbonising transport, you get rid of particulate matters, NOx gases, all of these come out of the network, and that reduces sickness, and there are so many health benefits associated with that. Social inclusion. If people are connected, they can see each other more often. They're able to move around quickly, cheaply. They're able to see family, friends, whatever it is. So social inclusion is a big, important, wider economic benefit. A reduction in transport poverty. This is the concept that people that are living in households on lower incomes where there's a lack of an alternative are forced to own a car. So it's this idea, and it's been researched a lot, and we've done research on it in Trinity, of forced car ownership. So people have to own a car. They may spend a higher percentage of their annual budget on a car compared to somebody that's wealthier people that have greater access to public transport. Access to employment and education, these are huge. The more access you have to these, the better. Rail networks and bus networks make shorter distances or reduce travel times between places, and it makes it more efficient to travel. And these wider economic benefits are something as well that we will put into any analysis that we do on things like Metro North or Dart Underground. And then we have more time. The less time you're traveling, nobody likes to travel. Travel is what we call, or transport is what we call a derived demand. Nobody really took joy in maybe travelling here to Malahide today, unless they walked or cycled and they were enjoying the nice sun outside. But if you're in a car, if you're in a train, etc., it's what we call a derived demand. You have to travel to get to where you need to be. But the less time you're spending travel, the more time you have to do other activities. So what about the future? So this is another question I was asked to look at, how the future will change. The climate mitigation strategy kind of looks at the traditional modes of transport, but there's a lot of uncertainty around, especially around the car, as to how the car is going to look in the future. So I'm going to talk about three of the main areas that are at the forefront of transport research at the moment. Car changing ownership models, autonomous and connected vehicles, which I'm sure you've all heard about, and then mobility as a service. So the first one is how we own cars. I would be confident in predicting how we own cars in the future will change. As you saw, it's a very wasteful resource. 95% of its time is spent parked, and I think people, younger people especially, as you'll see here in some of the statistics, are starting to realize that it's not a rite of passage to own a car, unless young people are taking up driver's licenses or learner permits, as you can see there in some of the data. It's decreased from 2008 to 2016. There are a number of reasons behind this: increasing car insurance, increasing costs, etc. So it becomes maybe prohibitive, but it's getting people to change and think about how they own a car. The shared economy has a lot of ideas in this area. Netflix for cars is something that's a big buzzword at the moment in terms of transport, whereby you never own a car. But like Netflix, you've got a month of a car, whatever car you like. So this example I want to show you here is a scheme called Book, and it's from the US that Cadillac have put up. You download an app, you request a vehicle, whatever type of vehicle you want. Somebody delivers it to your house, and then you drive until you want to change your car, or say you're going away on holidays. I don't need a car for the month of August. The car leaves you, and then it comes back if you want it later on. So this is a way in which car models are changing. We have it in Dublin and some of our cities, whereby Go Car and Ukyo, you're able to have a car without having the huge cost of owning one. Autonomous and connected vehicles, this is very much far into the future, whereby cars will talk to each other, they'll all be connected to the internet. But from a climate change and an emissions point of view, what the benefit would be is that the driving cycles will be improved, there will be shorter distances traveled, and there would be some form of emissions reduction. A lot of this is really blue skies thinking when it comes to it at the moment. The likelihood is by 2050, there would be very few cities that would have these connected vehicles, but it is something that is coming down the track. And the final thing I want to talk about in the future is mobility as a service. And the best analogy that I have for this is a mobile phone contract. So you have a mobile phone contract, and in your contract you get data, you get text messages, and say you get minutes that you are able to talk on the phone. So how mobility as a service would work is, again, you have a contract. Mobility no longer or travel no longer becomes something that you do, it's something that you subscribe to. You'd have a certain number of minutes for, say, bike sharing or bus use or tram use. You'd have a certain number of minutes then for taxis, and then you'd have a certain number of minutes to hire a car, like the system that I showed you there. So the difference between this is that you no longer have the big investment of owning a vehicle, and mobility becomes flexible, and it works around you as opposed to you working for it. And that's the idea of mobility as a service. It's something it's been launched in Finland and Helsinki, and this is something that's maybe more closer to the future than some of the other examples that I showed you, especially around autonomous vehicles. So how do we reduce our emissions? Public transport, obviously, is the key one here. It's also, just to state, it's very difficult, the task of reducing emissions in transport, because we're doing it against a backdrop of growing transport use. So we can't stand still, or the emissions will increase. But to try and reduce them, again, it's a very difficult feat. None of the options are easy, and none of the options are cheap. There's no easy solution. I would love to be able to give you the easy solution here today, but there isn't one. Public transport, as modal shift goes towards it, it's important that modal shift goes from private car usage to public transport, and not public transport one mode to the other mode. The research that we've seen in Dublin has shown that when the Lewis opened, it was a shift from bus to Lewis, so people got a better public transport service. Refueling our public transport networks, use of biofuels, electrification, this also needs to happen. And then also promoting walking and cycling. We've done very well in this area. There's a lot of things that we can be proud of in walking and cycling in our cities and across the country. Just to show you some data on this. So this is Dublin, obviously. This is 2006 and 2011. So the green areas show that 0 to 2% of people cycle. The yellow areas are between 2 and 4%. The orange areas, if you can see them, they're kind of closer to the city centre. So these areas here, it's between 3 and 5%. Then these red areas are higher again, up to 7%, and then the pink areas are above 7%. So you can see from 2006 to 2011, we've had a big increase in cycling in Dublin. And this has been mirrored across the other cities and other regions of the country as well. And in 2016, it's gone even further. So it's something that we have been able to achieve. But this is over a 15-year period that we've been able to achieve this. 10-year period that we've been able to achieve this. So none of these solutions, again, tend to be quick fixes. Electric vehicles are often seen as the solution here. The electrification of the private network of vehicles will decrease emissions. But the context in which we're working in really needs to be appreciated. In 2016, we sold 140,000 vehicles in Ireland. Less than 400 of those were electric vehicles. And in an overall car fleet of 2 million. So you can see the very, very low take-up of electric vehicles. The cost of promoting this solution is very high considering the poor uptake in this mode. One of the things I would say is that the incentives that have been put in place to use an electric vehicle, would they be better off spent by promoting cycling or promoting public transport? The other thing is in this space is that car manufacturers are going to change how they manufacture cars. Volvo, all of the big companies are announcing that by a certain date they will stop making internal combustion engines. There'll be no diesel and there will be petrol in terms of hybrids, but it's going to change naturally anyway. So should we be trying to be leaders here? Should we be really trying to push forward at great expense the use of electric vehicles? Is the investment in this worth it? So on this, in this area as well, in Trinity we've done research, obviously, on this, and there are 3 scenarios here. I'm going to consider the best scenario. Each of these blue bars here are CO2 emissions. All of them are going to increase by 2050. So this is a 2050 scenario. But by 2025, they're 2030 scenarios, out to 2030, my apologies. So by 2025, we're assuming that we could get 25% of all vehicles as electric vehicles, and then by 2030, 50%. The electricity that we looked at to fuel these cars was taken from the projected mix of the grid into the future, so we have taken that into account. But one of the things that you'll see here is to get to this target of 25%, it will require selling 580,000 electric vehicles up to 2025. I'm not sure how realistic that target is. I don't think it's realistic at all. Even at 10%, and we would have a 32% increase in emissions, you're still looking to sell at least 250,000 electric vehicles by 2025, from 400 last year. So the barriers to change, so see, these are some of the main barriers that I see. There's a very long planning period when it comes to building large public transport, and it's very expensive, but it is necessary. This is a barrier. Reducing car usage, this is even a bigger barrier. People love their cars. People like driving in their cars. So there has to be a big discussion, a big breakup with the car that needs to happen to get to these levels. The spatial configuration of our country is something that we have to consider. It's one of the main barriers that we have. If we're trying to build a rail network, rail needs people. It needs dense urban areas. And there's only a few of those really in the country. It's the spatial configuration means that we have to look at other modes. We need to look at the bus more, and we need to look at shared usage a bit more as well. And then finally, acceptance of electric vehicles. So each of these I'm going to discuss with some international examples. So I'm not going to talk about investment in public transport and rail and light rail, because that's done everywhere, and it's not that it's an easy thing to do, but it doesn't make for as interesting a conversation. So this bus comes from Scotland, and it's lucky that we have a Scottish speaker later on, from Strathclyde, and it's what we call demand responsive transport. So this is a solution for rural areas, less populated areas. In Strathclyde, they bought a number of these buses. Some of them run on a traditional bus route, but then some of them are demand responsive, that you have a mobile phone, you use technology to say where you want to go. You put that in terms of a booking system, and the bus will show up. There are examples of this in Ireland, but this is a way I would see in terms of rural transport that we could use. In terms of behavioural change, this was a project that I was involved in. Behavioural change can lean a lot on technology. So in this project, it's a schematic of a scheme that we built, where we built smartphones, a smartphone app that enabled people to change their behaviour. Essentially what we did was we gave people information on emissions. And with this information on emissions, we would see, was that changing their choice of mode of transport? Sadly, it didn't make any influence at all, but it was a very interesting research project, and the next stages of it will look at this. So you can see the behaviour change happened here. We got people to share their goals, etc. One of the key things here is that we were trying to make carbon something that people can understand, and that's one of the big gaps that we have, that people don't understand what carbon is. We've been very successful globally in talking what calories are. So we know what calories are, say in a bar of chocolate, and we'll go, no, I'm not having that because it's too high. That's not something that we've achieved yet in transport or any carbon areas. In terms of spatial configuration, this is an example from Australia. It's called transit-oriented design. So when you build housing or you build apartments, that you integrate public transport from the start. We have examples of this in Ireland and Adamstown, which wasn't all that successful. But in this case here, you can see there's apartments here. They all get free passes to use this light rail system, and the car parking is greatly reduced in this area. And this type of thing has been something that has been announced by the state recently as something that we could use. And then finally here again, hopefully that you can see this. This was taken from the US EPA website. And unfortunately, it's in miles, but it looks at the ranges of electric vehicles. Because one of the main things about electric vehicles is this range anxiety, that people don't want to try, are worried that they'll run out of power at a certain point. But at the top here, you can see Tesla. It has a 315 mile or over nearly 500 kilometer range in terms of this range anxiety. One of the things I feel about range anxiety is that maybe it's a good thing, that if you're worried about running out of power, then maybe you'll start to think about a different mode of transport. But again, this is all in this package of considering electric vehicles. So then, to start to conclude, what is the role of the state? Fund the construction of public transport. It is sorely needed in our cities. It may not have the huge emission savings, but there are other transport impacts that I've mentioned that will be impacted. How we evaluate transport needs to change. In terms of our cost-benefit analysis or our economics of it, we need to consider the real cost of carbon. If that were included, it would make a lot more projects, I would think, economically viable. We need to have a discussion about electric vehicles, a serious discussion. We need to talk about whether or not it's prudent to be incentivizing people to own probably a second car that is electric. It will have low emissions, and this change will happen, but we need to talk about this. We need to also consider, should we start to focus upon charging infrastructure? The fourth point I think that the state could help is with pilot schemes that, like the demand responsive buses in Strathclyde, the expense here isn't very high. A lot of our transport investment tends to be quite conservative. But pilot schemes, there have been a number that have been supported by the Department of Transport, but more of these, and where we can leverage EU funds as well to see how we could change our transport networks around behavioural change, etc. There's a big role that can be played by pilot schemes. And then finally, supporting behavioural change, which probably links into the fourth point as well. So, there are no easy solutions. Big decisions need to be made, and that's why we have you here this morning. Planning into the future needs to embrace technology to ease this transition into a low-carbon future. We need to fully appreciate how land use and transport are linked and how the spatial structure is one of the largest barriers that we have to providing good public transport. Some of the research that we've done on this, we looked at housing that was built during the Celtic Tiger, and we've seen that people that are living in these new housing units that are poorly planned have a lot longer distances to travel and more likely by less sustainable modes. We need to be prudent as well in our investment in electric vehicles. It needs to be fully explored. I don't think we need to be a world leader in electric vehicles. The market will take it, and it will give us, the cars will change. I want to finish on a positive note. All of these solutions will make Ireland greener, healthier, cleaner, more connected, and more efficient. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention this morning.